Crystal and 10-Ton Shadow off Dinoflagellate Blooms, and before that was Cosmos Brutal and Armadillo Stance off the Radiolarian Ooze. We have JG in the studio with us today. JG, how are you?
Howdy, how are you?
I'm well. And you performed, I think, 1 or 2 weeks ago at the River to River Festival.
Yeah, it was the weekend before last. Yep.
At the Michael Schimmel Center. And you have another event coming up, I think, next week. It's at Tribeca Cinemas?
Yeah, July 11th. It will be presented by Audience and River to River. And it will be a 5.1 playback of Dinoflagellate Blooms. This company, Audience, specializes in presenting surround sound presentations in cinema situations. So we'll be filling the room, locking the doors, turning off the lights, and inflicting that on you.
Fantastic.
It's really the way that it's meant to be heard. So it's not really heard in that manner so often. So I'm excited to be able to present that, especially at the Tribeca Cinema.
And it's free as well, right?
It's free, yeah, RSVP.
So yeah, be sure to check that out before it fills up. I'm sure it'll be a high demand event. Again, it is July 11th at the Tribeca Cinemas, and you can find out more information online at River to River. So I think we'll just start off by talking about kind of Fetus, your early work. We have one of the first things that you kind of put out on recordings, which is on the Anthology sync, but was released, I think, in 1981, January of 1981. And it's the track right. WKCR-FM.
Mm-hmm.
You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that was my first ever single, recorded in October 1980 and released on my own label, Self-Immolation, on January 1st, 1981. And I guess one of the impetuses of beginning Fetus and doing it in the manner which I did, which was where I played all the instruments, was having worked in a band situation and being disillusioned with democracy and deciding that I wanted to do something where I could stand and fall on my own merits. So I went into the studio and recorded and mixed both sides in a day, which is incredibly fast by my current standards. I'd been working with this group, Nurse with Wound, and for some time, and I used the same studio as they did, and I did it under the name Fetus Under Glass, and on the back sleeve, I mentioned a bunch of forthcoming releases under different names with variations on Fetus, and that's kind of how the ball got rolling on that. It started off as kind of a whimsical joke. One of them was Fetus on the Beach, and this is under the name Fetus Under Glass, and I think you'll hear the first half of this piece is kind of a weird punk rock homage to Philip Glass.
Yeah, I mean, the sound that you have, even on this very kind of first record, is almost fully formed. It's not that different from what you started working at in the early 80s and the mid 80s, that very kind of antagonistic, but as a lot of people will term it industrial, but that's the
I don't use the I word.
No, yeah, exactly.
So
I know that
I
you
word.
don't like that word. So it's kind of this. It starts out with that systems music sort of kind of piece where it's almost like a layering of arpeggios or just kind of little things, and you can tell that there's a kind of Philip Glass, Steve Reich. I know you knew some John Cage stuff before you moved to London, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, funnily enough, the day that I received finished copies of this Fetus Under Glass single, which was in December of 1980, that night I went to see John Cage perform with Merce Cunningham in London, and I had copies of my first single there. I was 20 years old. There was an intermission, and John Cage was sitting in the orchestra pit by himself, and I thought I've got to waltz down there and give him a copy, and I didn't. I chickened out. I didn't have the nerve to do it. Knowing his disdain for recorded material, now I'm kind of glad that I didn't, because it might have changed the course of my history.
Great. Well, you're going to have a chance to listen to that track in just a moment. Again, it is entitled OKFM by Fetus Under Glass, the first of the many Fetus pseudonyms that J.G. Thirlwell recorded under, and you're going to hear that right now. was the track OKFM, played off the Anthology Sync, released in 1989, but first released in 1981 as a single by the artist Fetus Under Glass. Fetus, of course, the moniker of J.G. Thirlwell, who's in the studio with us here at WKCR-FM New York. So, kind of, as we talked about right before we listened to that track, you have a lot of history with kind of new music composition in addition to rock music. You were kind of around with Nurse with Wound and White House, kind of in London at that time, but you were also kind of listening to John Cage, listening to kind of much more highbrow music, as some would term it. Kind of, you've worked with Bang on a Can, who seem to have a lot of the same influences. They kind of are of the generation that grew up listening to Reich, listening to Philip Glass, and kind of around the same time as Glenn Branca with his symphonies. Do you want to talk about maybe how they influenced you in a very concrete way?
I think that, you know, that post-minimalist generation, they made a bit of a twist in classical form and in composition form, where it was informed by a whole lot of different styles, and especially people who have been studying their instruments and are graduating now or in the last 10, 15 years, have been informed by electronic music and by world music and by classical and by rock and a really broad array of stuff, and also improvisation, and which is maybe something that you might not have gotten 30 years ago. So it is a kind of a melting pot of new music, and I think that New York City is a really a great fountain of that, with Bang on a Can, with the Ecstatic Music Festival like New Amsterdam and Poisson Rouge and the Wordless Music Orchestra and Ice Ensemble and people like, you know, we were mentioning Flux Quartet, Mivos Quartet, you know, Now Ensemble. There's a lot of people coming up who, you know, are also bringing work to young composers as well, to write within their instrumentation. So I think it's a really exciting time.
And around 30 years, I think it was around 30 years ago when you moved to New York,
Mm-hmm.
There was a similar kind of scene of musicians with Sonic Youth, with Swans, and Thurston Moore was a member of Glenn Branca's ensemble. So there is, you know, even then still a mix between rock and kind of new music at that time. Do you think that you were kind of influenced by the people kind of around you in New York at that time, or that you kind of brought a fully formed set of musical ideas?
I think when I first heard Sonic Youth and Branca when I was living in London, and I actually saw Branca in London, and that was a kind of a breath of fresh air, because I think what he was distilled down to this kind of an essence where of purity of vision, of purity of sound, but also of dissonance too, and that's something that I was kind of hungry to hear, that combination of, where you're listening to volume and overtone and dissonance, and he also wasn't scared to use crescendo upon crescendo, and that was really what brought a kind of a rock element to it. I think that he really, in some ways, was using kind of classical tropes in a rock format, and I think that certainly Sonic Youth kind of took that and built upon it, and added their own things and their own tunings, but also put it in song format. But when you look back on post-punk bands as well, like say Wire, for example, they were also using that kind of dissonance and rubbing of tones and minimalism as well, and reaching those conclusions from very different places.
Do Did you always see yourself more as a composer than a kind of performer? I know you play all the instruments on, your records, and it's very much a kind of performative work, but at the same time, I've kind of heard you describe yourself in interviews as a non-musician, that you kind of don't see yourself particularly as kind of the person in that sense.
Well, I call myself a non-musician because if you say that you're a musician, usually someone says, what do you play? And my answer has to be, well, I play a lot of instruments. I'm not really proficient on any of them, but I use the studio to give the illusion that I can play. And since the advent of MIDI and sampling, that was really a way to organize what I'd been doing all along with tape loops and spinning in tapes, spinning in sounds, vary speed, and overdubbing. So it's a faster way to say that you're a non-musician. But I definitely come from a bedrock of composition, really out of necessity, because since I was playing everything myself, I had to organize it beforehand. I only had 8 tracks. It wasn't improvised. I had a limited amount of time, and the clock was ticking, so I would go in with everything worked out as to how I was going to compose, how I was going to create the tracks, what order I was going to record the things in, because that was important as well. If you wanted to put 30 tracks down on 8 tracks, you have to plan that in advance and decide, okay, I'm going to put 6 tracks of backing vocals down, then I'm going to bounce them to 1, and then I'll do 6 tracks of percussion and bounce that to 1. And so, it had to be figured out in advance. So, right back to the early works, there's, strong compositional thread.
We're going to move right into some tracks off the Anthology sync. We're going to start with Sick Minutes and move on to Rattlesnake Insurance, Himmelsfahrtstransport / Primordial Industry, and finish off with Spit on the Griddle. Do you want to give a short introduction to those?
These are kind of condensed versions of those tracks. That side of the sync album was sort of covering a lot of instrumental work that I'd done up until then. There's expanded versions of the Sick Minutes track is on the Limb Anthology, which came out a couple of years ago, which is early instrumental works from 1980 to 83. I think we should just listen to it.
Great. Again, this is a series of tracks off the Anthology sync, starting with Sick Minutes. You're listening to WKCR-FM New York 89.9 on your radio dial and online on the web at WKCR.org. Today we have with us J.G. Thirlwell in the studios, and he is talking about, among other things, his upcoming performances with Manorexia at the Tribeca Cinemas on July 11th, and quite a bit of music. So, JG, do you want to tell us a little bit about the tracks we heard, which you can get on a new anthology and your upcoming performance?
That's from this album Sync, and that's a lot of my the early instrumental work. It's also the extended versions of that is on an anthology called what was this one called? Limb, which came out a couple of years ago, exclusively available from my website, fetus.org, and it comes with a 48-page book and DVD about me. Limb is interesting because it does show a real lineage between what I was doing back then and what I'm doing now.
For the majority of your career, you've had some sort of self-distribution network or kind of record label. The first tracks were released on Self-Immolation, and then you have Entopic Ents kind of now. And
Ectopic.
Ectopic, yes, sorry. Mm-hmm. And I think at one point you've drawn a comparison between yourself and the Residents, who of course kind of are the seminal anonymous band who's been around since the early 70s, and you're both extremely prolific artists doing widely diverse things. So I'm curious to see kind of how you conceive yourself in their kind of pretty big footsteps, or where you see yourself in relation to them.
I can't deny that the Residents had a big impact on me when I first heard them. In fact, I was talking with someone the other day, and I have to say that the first time I heard the Residents, which was probably in about 76 on a radio special that they created, it was one of the most pivotal listening experiences in my life. It was when I heard their music, it was the kind of music that I'd always wanted to hear, but I'd never been able to articulate. It was strange, discordant, but it felt like it was coming from some kind of a parallel universe and a kind of a weird fever dream. And their presentation, of course, as well, the anonymity, the mystique that they built up around themselves with their art and films and record covers and printed mythology was, extremely exciting and alluring to me, and I don't deny that I wanted to it influenced me in creating a mythology around what I did to begin with, which I didn't really keep up for too long, it's too difficult to do, but also disseminating false information about who I was, where I came from, and so on, which I did for the first couple of years, and I stayed in anonymity for a while. I didn't have my picture on record covers. It was just presented as something that you had to take in and judge on its own merit.
On their first EP, Santa Dog, they have a similar style to what I see in the tracks that we just heard. I mean, obviously not the exact same, but there's a sense of collage, a sense of kind of hyperactive energy that is also kind of throughout your whole catalog of music. We've talked about kind of incorporating new music and rock into one genre, but I'm interested in how you see yourself kind of creating assemblages, collaging different types of music into one kind of thing from a kind of sonic standpoint.
That's something that always kind of came to me pretty naturally without really trying to analyze why and wherefore. And I think that a lot of the music that I was always drawn to had a lot of twists and turns and colliding musical styles and strange sections, and went from one thing to another. And also, I think I've always been informed by soundtrack music, and when you listen to soundtracks disembodied from the film, there's often passages where things will build or they'll change mood radically in a short period of bars because they're illustrating something that's on the screen, and I find that compelling as well.
Speaking of soundtrack artists, I know that Raymond Scott is sort of an influence on you, and he was very well known for being or composing many of the musical tunes that were used in the Looney Tunes, as well as being a very kind of interesting electronic music inventor and composer. And he has a record, Manhattan Research Inc., which is kind of pretty groundbreaking for its time. So I thought we'd listen to a few tracks off that, and it has a similar kind of musique concrète sensibility. It has kind of this energy, but also always has this reminiscence of pop culture, reminiscence of the kind of the old world, the jazz, and all that kind of stuff. That it almost seems like a proto residence, a proto kind of fetus. So we're gonna.
I also covered a Raymond Scott song.
You did with
Powerhouse.
Yeah. I think it was a Steroid Maximus.
Yeah.
So obviously, a interesting fellow. I'm going to listen to two tracks off the album Manhattan Research Inc. These are Take Me to Your Violin Teacher and BC 1675. Again, we're going to be right back after that, continuing our interview with JT Thirlwell here on WKCR-FM New York.
BC 1675.
You just heard a series of tracks by Raymond Scott, and those were from the album Manhattan Research Inc., entitled Take Me to Your Violin Teacher and BC 1675. This is Afternoon New Music here on WKCR. The time is 4:50, and we are in the studio with J.G. Thirlwell, the man of many pseudonyms. He's recorded under Manorexia, under many different iterations of Fetus, under
Steroid Maximus,
Wise Blood, to name only a few of his groups. And you can, as we've said, check out his music at fetus.org. So we were talking in the break a little bit about kind of electronic music and the early kind of innovators of that being the Columbia Princeton Music Center, being Pauline Oliveros, being people like Bruce Hawk and Raymond Scott. Kind of how did you get into that kind of stuff?
I've always been pretty searching, for new music and pretty hungry for it. And it was the typical thing of pre-internet music discovery, a lot of slavishly reading music papers and looking at the back of covers, and one thing leads to another, and you see Frank Zappa talking about Varese, and you go and listen to Varese, and then that'll open the door to other things. But then you'll see these records sitting in the record shop, and you'll go and investigate. And I worked at a record store for a long time, and that's how some things unfolded to me. One thing led to another.
I know you're a pretty big concert goer. You go to a lot of different performances, and I think, according to some people who were there, that you were at the Kevin Drum performance at Issue Project Room.
You got your spies out.
Yeah. But so, kind of, were the contemporary music at the time kind of building off of that, and like, were you able to see performances of that kind of stuff in London when you were there in New York, or was it mostly just archival digging and then kind of animating that music in your own work?
No, there were performances of that type of thing in New York. I mean, as I said, I saw Cage, and I saw, another pivotal musical moment for me was Steve Reich's drumming, and that's I saw that in London in the early '80s. There was a lot of off-the-radar stuff, like the London Musicians Co-op and improv things like that. But also the time that I was there, was living there, was from 78 to 83, and that was a very exciting time for independent music stuff, under the Rough Trade family, and, everything from Joy Division, Robin Gristle, Cabaret Voltaire, Swell Maps, Wire, pop group, stuff like that. So that was a really fertile time. And
were you also able to kind of listen into kind of exports from other countries? I know that you kind of were involved with Einstützen and Neubauten, but there's also kind of the early Krautrock stuff coming out of Cannes and coming out of, I'm blanking on the name right now, it starts with an F. Perhaps you can...
Faust,
yeah. And so, who could forget Faust?
Yeah.
But there, and actually the cover to one of your, the newest Manorexia album kind of reminds me of one of their covers, with the kind of the hand, the bony hand. Yeah. Mm. So, I mean, did they also play kind of a big role?
Yeah, well, actually, I grew up in Melbourne, Australia, and when I was a kid, there was a store in a little arcade that... specialized in krautrock, And if you can believe in the mid-'70s that there was a Krautrock store in Melbourne, it's incredible. When I think back on it, that it was all Kraut, European prog, and bootlegs. So, yeah, I mean, I was aware of all that. I read Melody Maker from cover to cover every week. You know, Can were a pretty popular group at that point. Yeah, as I said, you connect the dots, and, I had all those, I was very aware of Krautrock and stuff. And then, of course, working in the record store, I was aware of the independent German scene that was brewing as well.
And Can are kind of interesting in that they were almost a kind of strange collection of people from different disciplines. That their drummer was a pretty well-known free jazz drummer. Their singers throughout the course of their career were kind of amateurs who were improvising to the music, and they're very much an ensemble, just like a jazz group almost.
Well, Olga Truke, I think, also studied with Stockhausen.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, he had a very classical music background, and he was trained, and so you have this clashing of various different things. And I know a lot of your kind of recent work is with ensembles. So, Manorexia is a group that you kind of perform with, but are also conducting in a way. Do you want to talk about how you kind of envision yourself as kind of a leader of that group, but also a part?
Well, Manorexia started as just me, and I always envisioned it as revoicing it, firstly for percussion and strings, and then piano and electronics kind of came into the picture as I started to revoice those compositions. And fortunately, there's a great pool of players. Both I have an ensemble in London and one in New York, and I've been able to build up a really great ensemble of players in both places, and really. What it's all about is really getting the composition on the page, and they make me look good.
And are the players mostly from classical backgrounds? Are they kind of the same sort of people who would be playing like Ligeti, like Feldman string quartets that are suddenly kind of brought into this new strange world? Or are they?
They're all from classical backgrounds, or new music backgrounds. It's not so unusual for them to know about all sorts of musical styles. The album that came out on Zodic, which is the Mesopelagic Waters, is a representation of chamber ensemble versions of pieces from the first two Manorexia albums, and David Costin from the Bang on a Can All Stars plays on that, and also Felix Fan from the Fox Quartet, and also Lena Papach and Dave Broom and Karen Waltuck and Eleanor Park. So some of whom I met in the Bang on a Can universe, and then one player leads to another, and
Right. And of course, just to remind people that you can listen to the latest album from Manorexia that came out in 2011, this 11th, July 11th, funny coincidence there, at the Tribeca Cinemas in 5.1 surround sound, like you can't really hear at home or on the radio or anywhere else, really. So just check that out at River to River and Tribeca Cinemas. It's presented with audience?
Audience, yes, yeah. And the composer will be present.
The composer is present now in the studios with us, and we're probably, well, before we get into some more work, why don't we talk about a friend of yours, Christian Marclay, who kind of embodies a lot of the same things that we've been talking about. He's well known now as a filmmaker. His film The Clock had long lines at MoMA for months, and if you happen to see it, you would know why, because it's pretty out there.
Mind-blowing.
Yeah. One crazy 24-hour film construction. But he also is a very, very fantastic musician. He has...
And composer.
And composer, yeah.
I think he really has pushed the envelope in composition where it collides with visual art and with improvisation and with interpretation of wide open interpretation. Yeah,
I mean, like Marclay, you are both a visual artist and kind of a musician. Kind of, he's well known for designing his covers and having a lot of kind of very interesting visual art. But you also design all of your album covers and have a pretty long history in that. So do you want to talk about kind of your roots in visual arts and how that informs your music?
Yeah, I mean, I went to art school for a couple of years, and that really laid the foundation of what I've continued to do through my record covers, which is, a lot of which is recognizable because of the palette of red, white, and black that I use, and also what started as inspiration from advertising and constructivism and propaganda, and has since blossomed out into all sorts of different areas, but and also into sculpture and so on. But that's one of the through lines of my work, which along with all of my albums having all the Fetus albums having 4-letter, 1-syllable titles. Apart from that, it's kind of stylistically I'm all over the place.
Great. So we're going to listen to a track off the latest Fetus album, which is Hide. It was released in 2010, I believe.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. And we're going to listen to a track entitled Concrete, which is kind of has its bases in musique concrète. And after that, we're going to listen to something off the Venture Brothers soundtrack. Venture Brothers, of course, being the very interesting and fantastic cartoon on Adult Swim by Jason Public and Doc Hammer.
Jackson Public.
Jackson Public.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Good correction. Thank you. And so be sure to check that out as well.
And it's scored by J.G. Thirlwell.
Scored by J.G. Thirlwell, of course. So we're going to listen to a selection from that score and a selection from the newest Fetus album. Again, this is Concrete off the album Hide. You're listening to WKCR-FM New York. This is Afternoon New Music, and the time is 5:07 in the afternoon. We are here today with J.G. Thirlwell in the studio, and you just heard some tracks off two of his most recent albums. The first was off the new Fetus album Hide from 2010, and it was the track Concrete. And the second was off the Venture Brothers soundtrack, released in 2009, I believe, and it was entitled Damien.
That's actually the last Fetus album. The new Fetus album will actually come out in September, which is a companion album to that, and continues some of the themes that are on Hide, that album was kind of about the culture of fear, but I really started digging into my exploration of operatic bombast and using opera singers, and I'm continuing that on the companion album, which is coming out in September, with a view to, I have a 5-year plan of making an opera, and so I'm kind of workshopping it in public. But I had Abby Fisher singing on Hyde, and she also sings on the latest one along with Natalie Galpern, and there's a lot of their voice on there.
So I'm sure a lot of people will be very excited to hear a J.G. Thirlwell composed opera. Mm-hmm. But what is that the only kind of things you have in the works? Are there anything in the future tours, future CDs, future collaborations? Well,
the Fetus album comes out in September at the same time as a soundtrack that I did a couple of years ago for a film called The Blue Eyes. That's under the name J.G. Thirlwell, and that's a chamber soundtrack. So that's the instrumentation on that is violin, viola, French horn, bass trombone, tuba, and contrabass with some electronics. Those two albums will come out at the same time, around the same time as an album that I produced for Zola Jesus, which is some of her works reimagined for string quartet and electronics, and we'll be doing some live dates around that. What else is coming up? Season 5 of The Venture Brothers is on the air right now. And many other things. You can check out fetus.org for all the information.
Great. So, of course, do that, and of course, check out the show this 11th, July 11th, at Tribeca Cinemas to hear the Manorexia album Dinoflagellate Blooms in its full entirety, in the way that it was meant to be listened to, with the composer J.G. Thirlwell in person for all of your needs. I don't know. for everything you want to see. If you want to see J.G. Thirlwell and listen to some fantastic music, go to Tribeca.
I will not be taking complaints, though.
Of course. So, while in the last few minutes that we have, there's a fun little fact that I know that you were a big fan of glam rock when you were younger, David Bowie, T-Rex, and all those folks. Mm-hmm. And there's an interesting kind of dynamic.
That was my rite of passage.
Yeah, in which
also Alice Cooper, Sensational Alex Harvey Band. Yeah.
Well, you get that sort of music feeding into punk and getting very experimental in that transition, but you also have it feeding into kind of people like you, and there's this sort of kind of strange tree branch effect where all these people from glam rock, which seems like the farthest away from contemporary and experimental music you can get, at least sonically, if not ideologically, they might have some kind of similar things to say, but that they kind of come down into all these very weird factions that have extremely experimental kind of ethoses. Do you have anything to say about that, or is that an accurate observation?
Well, I think that the glam rock was kind of a kind of a pre-echo of punk rock in some ways, and if you listen to, I don't know, at the time, I think to sort of lump everyone together under that moniker glam rock, there's a lot of different strands of it, and what's the unifying factor, like platform boots and makeup. There's you've got Roxy Music and David Bowie, whose music have been co-opted many times over, and they really have stood the test of time. But then you have bands like Slade, T-Rex, The Sweet, the whole Chin and Chapman stable that were pumping out hits. And, I mean, and then unto themselves, I mean, they were really good, concise pop statements, Gary Glitter. But then I think that a lot of people passed through that, and like Alice Cooper and the sensational Alex Harvey band, who I mentioned, and those two groups in particular. I think that the way that they combined disparate styles, really had an impact on me. In that within any one piece of music, Alex Harvey, for example, could go from this sort of bombastic rock to a very cinematic thing. It could be spoken word, then it'll go into a few bars of country western, and then another couple of bars of something else, and then they had brass arrangements and string arrangements, and that everything in the kitchen sink effect, I think, to someone like me, that was very exciting to hear, and, the early Alice Cooper records also had, if you listen to Schools Out, there's some amazing brass and arrangements by Bob Ezrin.
Well, I mean, and another figure from around that time period, Brian Eno, who was, involved with Roxy Music, and then kind of went on to do his own early records, which were in that same style, but now, of course, is this kind of very, highly regarded composer in his own right, and has worked with Bang on a Can and similar people. And also, not really even to lump him in with glam rock, but kind of Scott Walker being this like pop idol sensation, kind of very bombastic, and then turning into this crazy, with Bish Bosh and Tilt, and this extremely kind of avant-garde work. There seems to be kind of a pattern of that kind of trajectory, even
Bowie as well.
Bowie, who started out as a kind of '60s pop. If you listen to his first album with the kind of straight cut, almost like Beatles style hair, and then you get to the the crazy Ziggy Stardust things. I mean, you didn't really start out with that glam rocky kind of appearance. It almost kind of just has always been kind of both in your music at the same time, and I think that's kind of what sets you apart. Is that there's always
glam
been,
rock. Glam rock.
No. There's like this. There's been this kind of very almost transcendent kind of energy and stuff like that you get from glam rock. That's always been in Fetus and all that kind of stuff, but also an experimental aspect, and they always go hand in hand. And so there's while there's a difference between listening to a Manorexia album and a Fetus album, you kind of always get these two clashing forces that kind of knit together. Whereas with these other artists, they have this progression towards something else. I mean, is there a reason that you've taken that path, or is that just a natural thing to do?
You can take the man out of the glam, but you can't take the glam out of the man.
Fantastic. I think that's a great way to close our interview here. We're going to listen to one final track before we get back into some Manorexia stuff, and this is off the Anthology that we mentioned previously, which you can get off fetus.org. You want to introduce that track?
Well, this track is called Sjogren Syndrome, and it actually started life as a musical phrase that I had input into this Casio, I guess you could call it a keyboard. It was kind of a cross between a keyboard and a calculator and a sequencer. It's the same machine that Krautrock used on the track Pocket Calculator. And it was, I guess, my first sequencer. You could actually input a sequence of notes into it and play them back. It also had a little drum machine in it, and it was this small consumer level thing, and you can hear it all over my early records. Well, I had this sequence of notes stayed in that machine, but I never actually used that in a composition. Then when I came to compile this album Limb with my early instrumental works, that sequence of notes came to light, and I decided to develop it and finish it. And so it's kind of it's the kind of one track on that album that's kind of started in 1980 and finished in 2009. And I've since gone on to do an arrangement of it with the Manorexia Live Ensemble. It's called Sjogren Syndrome. And Sjogren Syndrome is a phenomenon where one cannot produce saliva.
Interesting. I mean, as a lot of your, focuses are very kind of medical and throughout the ages. I have forgotten what I was going to say, but we'll just close it on one note. Of course, again, you can see J.G. Thirlwell and listen to his music July 11th at the Tribeca Cinemas. It's been a pleasure having you. We're about to jump right into Sjögren's syndrome. For those, of course, who listen to this have a big, or even, any background in music, it'll be very reminiscent of kind of Steve Reich or Glass kind of arpeggiated kind of sequences. So I hope you enjoy that. It's been a great interview, and thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Great. I'm going to jump right into that track.